In the courtroom, my son and my husband smirked at me, but I was the owner of everything they were fighting for. I revealed the secret that changed the verdict, and minutes later, the judge pronounced my revenge. I never imagined that their mocking laughter would become the sweetest moment of my life. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would. And if you, for a second, feel like this sounds familiar, I just ask that you leave a like and subscribe. It will help me to keep unburdening myself. My name is Eleanor Reed. I am 72 years old, and for the last 3 decades, I've lived in a 2-story brownstone in the South End of Boston. That Tuesday morning, I woke up at 6, as I always do. I put on my navy blue dress, the only presentable one I had left, and my low-heeled black shoes, the same kind I've bought from a downtown department store for the last 15 years. My hands trembled as I combed my hair in front of the bathroom mirror. Not from age, but from nerves. It was the day of the hearing. The day my own son, Arthur, and my husband of 31 years, Edward, would try to have me declared mentally incompetent to take away everything I had built with my own 2 hands. I had a coffee and a donut I'd bought the day before from Miller's Bakery, looking out my kitchen window at the dogwood tree I planted when Arthur was 10. Its white blossoms had fallen onto the mosaic patio tiles I had chosen myself, creating a carpet that contrasted with the ache in my chest. I remembered Arthur running across that same patio, tripping over his own feet, shouting, "Mom, Mom, watch," every time he managed to kick the ball a little farther. I would hug him, clean his scraped knees with antiseptic, and promise I would always be there for him. What an irony. Now he was the one who wanted to erase me from his life. The cab arrived promptly at 8:30. The driver, an older man with a graying mustache, helped me in. During the drive down Massachusetts Avenue, he asked if I was going to the hospital. "No, sir. I'm going to the family court at the Brook Courthouse," I replied, trying to keep my voice from breaking. "Any trouble, ma'am? My family wants to declare me crazy to take my house." The man looked at me in the rearview mirror with a mixture of sadness and indignation I recognized immediately. It was the same expression I had worn thousands of times when I worked as a nurse at Mass General and saw families fighting over the inheritance of patients who were still breathing. When I arrived at the courthouse, with its gray concrete walls and windows that looked like empty eyes, I felt as if I were walking into my own funeral. The smell of disinfectant and old paper reminded me of the government offices where I had spent decades filing paperwork to keep the documents for my house, my job, my life in order. I climbed the worn marble stairs, gripping the banister, not out of physical weakness, but because I needed something solid to hold on to while my world was crumbling. On the 3rd floor, outside the door to Family Courtroom 12, I saw Arthur on his phone. He was wearing a gray suit I recognized instantly. I had bought it for his college graduation, back when I was working double shifts at the hospital to pay for his business degree. Beside him stood Edward, my husband, in his rumpled white shirt and the red tie he always wore when he wanted to impress someone. He had that familiar smirk, the same one he'd flashed before saying, "Don't you worry, Eleanor, I'll handle it," right before things went wrong. When they saw me, Arthur hung up and looked at me as if I were a stranger. He didn't greet me. He didn't ask how I was. He simply sized me up, as if calculating the value of my clothes, how much time I had left, how much money he could get from my death. "You're on time," Edward said, without the kiss on the cheek he'd given me since we were dating. "I've always been on time," I replied, looking him straight in the eye. "Well, Mom," Arthur interjected, using that condescending tone he'd adopted in recent months, "I hope you understand this is for your own good. You can't live alone anymore, you can't manage your finances. You need help." The word help sounded like a slap in the face. For 47 years, I had worked non-stop. First as a nurse at Mass General, then as a private caregiver for the elderly, then selling homemade sandwiches at the entrance to the textile mill where Edward worked, always helping, always giving, always sacrificing. I walked into the courtroom with my back straight, though inside I felt like a building about to collapse. The room smelled of varnished wood and the tension of hundreds of families who had fought there before us. The dark wooden benches were arranged like church pews, but instead of praying, people came here to destroy one another. I sat in the front row, alone. Arthur and Edward sat on the other side of the aisle with their lawyer, a young man in glasses who was constantly shuffling through his papers. They looked like a team. They looked like they had it all planned. They looked sure they would win. But there was something they didn't know. Something I had kept secret for months while they plotted my destruction. A secret that would change everything they thought they knew about me, about my money, about my supposed mental incompetence. When the judge entered, a man in his 50s with a serious face and a perfectly trimmed beard, we all stood. He introduced himself as Judge Robert Castillo, and his voice echoed with the authority of someone accustomed to deciding the fate of families. Arthur's lawyer stood first and began to speak about my evident mental deterioration, about the episodes of confusion I had supposedly had, about my inability to make responsible financial decisions. As he spoke, I looked at my son. My boy, born when I was 25, after 8 hours of labor in a public hospital where the nurses yelled at me not to cry. My baby, whom I had raised alone for 17 years because his father left when he found out I was pregnant. My son, whom I fed with mac and cheese and whatever was on sale when we couldn't afford more, but who never went to bed hungry. Now, that same boy nodded every time his lawyer mentioned my supposed insanity. And in that moment, as I listened to them try to paint me as a senile, irresponsible old woman, I knew it was time to reveal the secret that would change everything. The secret that would make them understand that the woman they were trying to destroy was far more clever than they had ever imagined. The lawyer continued talking about my supposed incapacity, but I was no longer listening. My mind traveled back 30 years, to when I met Edward at the bus stop on my way to Mass General. He was a handsome man with wavy black hair and a smile that made me forget how tired I was after a 12-hour night shift. I fell for his promises. "We're going to be a real family," he'd tell me as we walked through the Boston Common on Sundays, my only day off. "Arthur will have a father, and you won't have to work so much." How naive I was to believe him. We were married at City Hall on a rainy Saturday in September. Arthur was 17 and happy to have a father figure to take him to play baseball in the park. I wore a simple white dress I'd bought at a consignment shop, and Edward wore a suit borrowed from his brother. There was no party, just a meal at home with roasted chicken and a 3-layer cake I baked myself. At first, everything seemed perfect. Edward worked at a textile mill in Lowell, and I continued my shifts at the hospital. We pooled our salaries for household expenses and to send Arthur to the private university he so desperately wanted to attend. "It's an investment in our future," Edward would say when I calculated the cost of tuition. But the promises faded like the smoke from the cigarettes Edward smoked on the patio. He never stopped working, but he did stop contributing his half of the expenses as we had agreed. "Things are tight at the mill this month," he'd say every payday. "Next month will be better." Next month never came. I worked more and more hours to compensate. In addition to my hospital shifts, I started caring for elderly people in their homes on my days off. Mrs. Gable, an 80-year-old with Alzheimer's, paid me $200 to stay with her on weekends while her family went to Cape Cod. Mr. Henderson, a retired teacher who couldn't walk well, needed someone to cook for him and give him his medicine every afternoon after I left the hospital. My hands always smelled of disinfectant and the ointments I applied to my patients. My feet swelled inside my white nursing shoes after walking miles down hospital corridors. My back ached from lifting patients and carrying grocery bags from the market to our house. But it was all worth it because Arthur was getting an education and because I believed we were building something together. The reality was different. Edward would come home from work, sit in front of the television with a Budweiser, and wait for me to serve him dinner. He never asked about my day, never offered to help clean, never cared if I was tired or sick. When I told him I needed help with the bills, he would sigh as if I were asking for the moon. "Don't be so dramatic, Eleanor. I work hard too," he'd reply, his eyes glued to the TV. "Besides, you always figure things out." Yes, I always figured things out. I figured out how to pay for Arthur's books when he wanted to get a master's degree. I figured out how to buy a new refrigerator when the old one broke down in the middle of a heat wave. I figured out how to take Edward to a private doctor when he got pneumonia and didn't want to go to the clinic because the wait is too long. I figured out how to swallow my pride when Arthur brought Jessica home, a girl from a wealthy family in Back Bay who looked at me like I was the hired help. "What does your mother do?" she asked Arthur the first time they came for dinner. When he explained I was a nurse, she smiled that fake smile people use when they think they're superior. "What a noble profession," she said, but her tone made it clear she didn't mean it. Jessica never spoke to me directly. She always addressed Arthur as if I weren't there. "Tell your mother the soup is too salty. Ask your mother if she can change the channel. Mention to your mother it would be nice to get new curtains for the living room." As if I were deaf or an idiot. But I swallowed it all because I wanted my son to be happy. When they got married, I paid for half the wedding with my savings. Jessica wanted it in the ballroom of a hotel in Back Bay, with waiters in white gloves and a 4-tiered cake. "It's a once-in-a-lifetime thing," Arthur told me when he saw the worried look on my face at the estimate. I worked double shifts for 6 months to save the money. I sold homemade soups and sandwiches at the hospital entrance during my breaks, using my mother's recipes. Chicken noodle, beef barley, split pea. The residents and other nurses bought from me because they knew my food was good and affordable. Every dollar I earned went into a cookie tin I hid under my bed. On the wedding day, Jessica introduced me to her family as Arthur's mother. Not as her mother-in-law, not as part of the family. Just Arthur's mother, as if I were an appendage, a footnote in the story of their marriage. During the toast, Arthur thanked everyone but me. He thanked Edward for being like a father to him. He thanked Jessica's parents for welcoming him into their family. He thanked his friends for being there. But the woman who had worked day and night to pay for his education, who had sold sandwiches in the street to fund his wedding, who had sacrificed her youth so he could have opportunities. He didn't even mention her. That night, I cried in my room while Edward snored beside me. Not from sadness, but from a strange emptiness, as if something inside me had been extinguished forever. It was the first time I realized that perhaps everything I had done, everything I had given, everything I had sacrificed, hadn't created the love and gratitude I expected. It had created an expectation. The following years were more of the same. Arthur and Jessica had 2 children, Samuel and Sophia, and I became the free babysitter they called whenever they wanted to go out. Just for tonight, Mom. We have a very important work dinner. There was always something important preventing them from looking after their own children. Meanwhile, Edward began to change. He wasn't just irresponsible with money, he became cruel with his words. "You're old, Eleanor. You're useless now. Why do you bother getting dressed up? Nobody's looking at you. I wish my first wife were still alive. She knew how to treat a man." His first wife had died of cancer 10 years before we met, but he idealized her whenever he wanted to hurt me. According to him, she was prettier, a better cook, more agreeable. She was perfect because she was dead and couldn't contradict him. I kept working, kept paying most of the bills, kept the house clean and dinner on the table. But something inside me had started to crack, like an invisible fissure in a teacup that grows larger with every use. The last straw came 6 months ago, on my 72nd birthday. Nobody remembered. Not Arthur, not Edward, not Jessica, not my grandchildren. I spent the whole day waiting for a call, a text, a visit. Nothing. The next day, Arthur showed up with a fake smile and an even faker excuse. "Sorry, Mom, it completely slipped my mind. How about we go out for a nice dinner to make up for it?" But instead of taking me to dinner, he asked to borrow money for Samuel's tuition. That night, alone in my kitchen, eating a slice of cake I'd bought to celebrate my birthday by myself, I made a decision that would change everything. I would no longer be the woman who gave without receiving, who forgave without being respected, who loved without being valued. It was time for them to learn who Eleanor Reed really was. I snapped back to the present when I heard my name echoing in the courtroom. Judge Castillo was asking if I understood why I was there. I stood up slowly, feeling every eye on me like a needle. "Yes, Your Honor. I understand perfectly," I replied, my voice clear, though my heart was pounding like a drum. Arthur's lawyer approached me with a condescending smile, holding a folder full of papers that supposedly proved my mental incompetence. He was a young man, perhaps my son's age, with designer glasses and a suit that cost more than I made in 3 months at the hospital. "Mrs. Reed, do you remember what you had for breakfast this morning?" he asked, as if I were a 5-year-old. "Coffee and a donut from Miller's Bakery," I answered without hesitation. "And do you remember how much money you have in the bank?" There was the trap. Arthur had been monitoring my bank accounts for months, taking advantage of the access I'd given him when he offered to help with the paperwork after my gallbladder surgery last year. He thought he knew everything about my money. "I have $437 in my checking account at Bank of America," I answered with complete honesty. The lawyer smiled triumphantly. Arthur nodded with satisfaction. Edward leaned back in his chair as if the case were already won. They believed an old woman with less than $500 in the bank was proof enough that she couldn't manage her finances. What they didn't know was that the nearly empty account was exactly what I wanted them to find. "Your Honor," the lawyer continued, "as you can see, the defendant has shown a clear inability to manage her resources. A woman of her age, with a government pension, should not have such meager savings. This demonstrates irresponsible financial decisions that put her well-being at risk." As he spoke, I looked at my family. Arthur was wearing the watch I had given him for his college graduation, a Tissot that cost me 2 months' salary. On Jessica's wrist was a gold bracelet I recognized immediately. It had belonged to my mother, and I had given it to her when Sophia was born. Edward was wearing the red tie I bought for our 10th wedding anniversary, back when I still believed gifts could buy love. They were all wearing pieces of my life, my work, my history, while trying to declare me incompetent to take what little I had left. The judge took notes and then looked at me directly. "Mrs. Reed, do you have anything to say in your defense?" I took a deep breath. This was the moment I had been preparing for months, ever since that lonely birthday night when I decided I would no longer be a victim of their manipulation. "Yes, Your Honor. I have a great deal to say." I took a manila envelope from my purse, which I had kept sealed throughout the hearing. Inside were the documents that would change everything they thought they knew about me. "Your Honor, it's true that I have $437 in my Bank of America account. But what my family doesn't know is that for the last 5 years, I've had another account at Fidelity, in my name only, where I have been depositing my real retirement income." The silence in the room grew thick, like the air before a thunderstorm. Arthur sat up straight. Edward frowned. The lawyer's smile vanished. You see, I continued, my voice growing stronger with every word, when I retired from Mass General after 40 years of service, I didn't just receive basic Social Security. I also have a supplemental pension from the Nurses Union, another from the Nursing Savings Fund, and one more from the State Employee Retirement System because I worked for 2 years at the Children's Hospital before transferring. I handed the papers to the judge. They were statements showing monthly deposits of over $2,000 for the last 5 years. More than $100,000 that I had accumulated while my family thought I was living on scraps. Furthermore, I added, pulling out another document, 3 years ago I sold a parcel of land in the Berkshires that I bought with my own savings back in 1985, when I was still single. A piece of property my husband never knew I owned, because I bought it with my money, in my name, before we were married. Edward turned pale. Arthur opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Jessica looked like she'd seen a ghost. I sold the land for $175,000. That money is invested in treasury bonds in my name, generating interest that is deposited monthly into my secret account. The judge reviewed the documents with growing attention. Arthur's lawyer stammered something about hidden information, but no longer sounded confident. But that's not all, Your Honor. I also want to present this. I took out my cell phone, a simple smartphone my family had always belittled. Why do you need a smartphone, Mom? You don't even know how to use it, Arthur had said when I asked for one last year. What he didn't know was that I did know how to use it, and very well. For the last 6 months, I have been recording conversations with my family. Conversations in which they have insulted, threatened, and manipulated me into signing documents that would transfer my assets into their names. I pressed play. Edward's voice filled the courtroom. You're useless, you stupid old woman. I wish you'd just die already so we can stop supporting you. Arthur tried to stand, but the judge motioned for him to remain seated. The recording continued. Mom, you're a burden. Don't you get it? Nobody wants you here anymore. Just sign the papers and go to a nursing home where you belong. Stop, the judge said. When were these conversations recorded? The most recent was a week ago, Your Honor. When they came to my house to pressure me one last time before the hearing, I played another recording. This time it was Jessica, talking on the phone with someone else. We just need her to sign the power of attorney and the house will be ours. The old lady is so senile she won't even notice. Arthur says we can put her in a state-run home afterward and forget all about her. The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. The judge no longer looked at me with the paternalistic pity reserved for confused old people. Now he looked at me with respect, as a woman who had been systematically abused by the people who supposedly loved her. Mrs. Reed, he said in a completely different tone, why did you keep your true financial situation a secret? Because I wanted to see how far they were willing to go, Your Honor. I wanted to confirm whether they loved me as family or just as a source of money and property. The answer is here, in this courtroom, where my own son and my husband have come to declare me crazy to steal what is mine. Arthur finally found his voice. Mom, we didn't know. If you had just told us, what difference would it have made? I interrupted. Would you have treated me better if you knew I had money? Did your love depend on my bank balance? I turned back to the judge. Your Honor, I am 72 years old, but my mind is perfectly clear. So clear that I was able to plan this demonstration of who these people really are for months. So clear that I could save evidence, manage multiple bank accounts, make smart investments, and prepare myself for this moment. The judge nodded slowly. Mrs. Reed, the evidence presented suggests that you are not only mentally competent, but that you have demonstrated a level of planning and foresight that few people of any age could achieve. He turned to Arthur's lawyer. Counselor, I hope you have very compelling evidence of mental incompetence, because so far, all I see is a woman who has been the victim of psychological and financial abuse by her own family. At that moment, Edward shot to his feet and shouted, This is ridiculous. That woman has been lying to me for years. I'm her husband, I have a right to know how much money she has. His words echoed in the room like a confession. He had confirmed exactly what I had been trying to prove, that his interest in me was purely financial. The judge looked at him with clear disgust. Mr. Reed, in this country, married women have the right to maintain private bank accounts. Your wife is under no legal obligation to inform you of all her finances, especially considering the evidence of abuse we have just heard. It was then that I saw something that filled me with a satisfaction I hadn't felt in decades. Arthur and Jessica began whispering desperately with their lawyer. Edward looked like he was about to have a heart attack. For the first time in 30 years, they were the ones who looked weak, confused, and defeated. And I, the senile old woman, was the one in control. But this was only the beginning. The best part of my revenge was yet to come. The judge called a 15-minute recess to review all the evidence I had submitted. As I walked out of the courtroom, I could hear my family's frantic whispers. Arthur was pacing like a caged animal. Jessica was crying what looked more like tears of frustration than sadness, and Edward was sitting with his head in his hands, muttering to himself. I went down to the small cafe on the ground floor of the courthouse. I ordered a black coffee and sat by the window overlooking the street. From there, I could see people hurrying to their jobs, to their normal lives, unaware that on the third floor, a 72-year-old woman was living the most important moment of her existence. The coffee tasted strong and bitter, just the way I liked it. How different my situation was now. I had money but had discovered that the love I thought I had was an illusion carefully constructed by people who only wanted to take advantage of me. I hadn't finished my first sip when Arthur appeared at my table. He looked pale, with dark circles under his eyes and trembling hands. He sat down without asking, as if he still had the right to invade my space. "Mom, we need to talk," he said, his voice cracking. "Now you call me Mom," I replied without looking at him, my eyes fixed on my cup. An hour ago, I was the senile old woman who can't manage her finances. We didn't know you had so much money. If we had known. What? You would have treated me better." I looked him straight in the eye. "Arthur, listen to yourself. You're saying your love for me depended on how much money I have in the bank." He ran his hands through his hair, a habit he'd had since he was a boy when he felt frustrated. "It's not that, Mom. It's just, well, we thought you needed help. The house is too big for you alone, and your income seemed so low." "My income seemed low because you never bothered to truly ask about my situation. You assumed I was a burden, a useless old woman living on pennies. And you know what? I let you think that because I wanted to see just how far you would go." Arthur tried to take my hand, but I pulled it away. "Mom, we made mistakes, but we're family. We can fix this." "Family?" I laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. Family doesn't sue each other to steal property. Family doesn't record conversations planning how to get rid of grandma. Family doesn't call the person who gave them everything senile. Just then, Jessica arrived, her eyes red and her makeup smeared. She approached our table as if every step pained her. "Eleanor, please, you need to understand our perspective," she said, using that sweet, fake tone she reserved for when she wanted something. "The children need financial stability. Samuel is starting private high school next year, and Sophia needs piano lessons. We were just thinking of their future." "My grandchildren's future?" I asked. "Or your future, without having to work so hard to maintain the lifestyle you want?" Jessica blushed. "It's not fair for you to make us look like the villains. We took care of you, we included you in family gatherings." "You included me?" I stood up, feeling indignation give me strength. "Is that what you call inviting me over to babysit for free while you went out to parties? Or having me sit alone at the dinner table while you talked about your plans without ever consulting me?" "Eleanor, you're exaggerating." "Am I exaggerating?" I took out my phone and found another recording. "Do you want me to play the conversation where you told your sister you hoped I would die soon so you could sell the house and buy a bigger one in Back Bay?" Jessica turned white as a sheet. Arthur looked at her in shock, as if he hadn't known about that conversation. It was clear there were secrets and betrayals between them, too. I said that in a moment of frustration. "I didn't mean it." "Of course you meant it. And the worst part isn't that you thought it, but that I was foolish enough not to see what you really thought of me sooner." At that moment, Edward appeared, striding toward us with a furious look on his face. He had the expression he got when he was drunk and looking for a fight, but this time he was completely sober. "Who do you think you are, Eleanor?" he shouted, not caring that we were in a public place. "How dare you humiliate us like this? I'm your husband. I have a right to know about everything you own." People in the cafe turned to stare. An older woman at the next table looked at me with pity. A young man working on his laptop closed it so he wouldn't miss the show. "You have no rights, Edward," I replied, my voice calm but firm. "My money is mine. I earned it with my work, and I can do whatever I want with it. But we're married. What's yours is mine." "Really? And when was the last time you shared your paycheck with me? When did you ask if I agreed before you bought your new truck? When did you include me in decisions about your investments?" Edward fell silent because he knew I was right. For 30 years, he had managed his finances like a single man while expecting me to pay for half of everything with my nurse's salary. "Besides," I continued, "I have something else to tell you, Edward. Something that will close this chapter of my life for good." I pulled another envelope from my purse, this one thicker than the last. "Remember when you told me your first wife was better than me at everything? That she knew how to treat a man?" Edward nodded suspiciously. "Well, I hired a private investigator to look into your marital history. And you know what I found?" I showed him the photographs. They were pictures of Edward with a blonde woman, going in and out of a motel on the highway to New Hampshire. The dates on the photos showed he'd been going there every Wednesday for the past 2 years. "Your first wife isn't dead, Edward. Her name is Patricia Sandoval, she lives in Nashua, and you've been visiting her every week while telling me you were working overtime at the mill." The silence that followed was deafening. Arthur and Jessica stared at the photos with their mouths agape. Edward looked like a fish out of water, opening and closing his mouth without being able to speak. But wait, there's more, I continued, savoring every second of his humiliation. It turns out Patricia never legally divorced you. Which means our 30-year marriage is completely invalid. You're a bigamist, Edward. Eleanor, I can explain. There's nothing to explain. For 2 years, you told me you were working extra to save for our retirement, when you were actually with your real wife, spending the money I thought we were saving together. I stood up and put the photos back in my purse. And by the way, I've already filed a complaint for bigamy with the district attorney's office. The police will be looking for you at the house as soon as this hearing is over. Edward collapsed into a chair, his face the color of ash. Arthur didn't know whether to comfort his stepfather or keep trying to convince me to forgive them. Jessica was crying openly, but I knew her tears were from the panic of losing the inheritance she'd been counting on, not from sadness over my pain. Now I understand why you wanted to have me declared incompetent so quickly, I told them. You knew it was only a matter of time before I discovered all your lies. You thought if you locked me away in a home and took control of my assets, you could continue living comfortably off my money while I rotted away, forgotten in some corner. I checked my watch. The recess was over. It was time to go back to the courtroom to hear the judge's decision. Let's go, I said. It's time for you to learn what it means to face a woman who has nothing left to lose, because she finally understood she never had anything to keep. As we walked back to the courtroom, I felt lighter than I had in decades. Each revelation, each exposed truth, had lifted a weight from my shoulders. I was no longer the silent victim I had been for 30 years. I was a free woman, and they were about to find out how dangerous a woman who has reclaimed her power can be. When we returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere had completely changed. Judge Castillo was waiting for us with a serious expression, surrounded by all the documents he had been reviewing during the recess. Beside him, a clerk was taking notes, and a court officer who hadn't been there before was standing by. My family sat on the right side, but they no longer looked like the united team they had been. Arthur avoided looking at Edward, Jessica had sat as far away from both of them as possible, and Edward seemed to have shrunk inside his suit, as if wanting to disappear. I sat on the left side, alone, but for the first time in years, I didn't feel abandoned. I felt free. The judge stood, and the entire room fell silent. After carefully reviewing all the evidence presented, he began in a solemn voice, "This court has reached a definitive conclusion." I could hear my own heart beating, but it was no longer from nerves. It was anticipation, like waiting for the first cry of a newborn baby or the results of a medical test that could change your life forever. First, the judge continued, the evidence presented by the plaintiffs to declare Mrs. Eleanor Reed incompetent is not only insufficient, but it demonstrates the exact opposite. Mrs. Reed has exhibited a capacity for financial planning, personal organization, and legal foresight that many people of any age would envy. Arthur shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His lawyer tried to interrupt, but the judge silenced him with a gesture. Second, he went on, the audio evidence presented by Mrs. Reed constitutes clear proof of psychological violence, emotional manipulation, and financial abuse on the part of the plaintiffs. These behaviors are not only morally reprehensible, but they constitute offenses under the state's elder protection laws. Jessica began to cry silently. Arthur stared at the floor as if the courtroom carpet were the most interesting thing in the world. Therefore, the judge said, his voice rising, this court not only completely dismisses the petition for incompetence but also orders that a district attorney's investigation be opened into the plaintiffs for the crimes of elder abuse and attempted financial fraud. A silence so profound fell that I could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Then, the judge addressed me directly. Mrs. Reed, I am deeply sorry that you had to come to a court of law to prove something that should be obvious to anyone, that you are a woman of integrity, intelligence, and are fully capable of managing your own life. I stood as he beckoned me to the stand. Furthermore, he added with an almost imperceptible smile, I want to commend you on how you handled this situation. Not many people would have the patience and strategic intelligence to gather evidence for months while enduring this kind of abuse. Thank you, Your Honor, I replied, feeling as though a 1,000-pound weight had been lifted from my shoulders. The judge struck his gavel on the desk. Case closed. And let this serve as a reminder that elderly adults in this country have the same rights as anyone else, regardless of the opinions of greedy family members. When we left the courthouse, Arthur tried to approach me one last time. Mom, please, we can talk about this at home. There's nothing to talk about, Arthur. And there's no home where we can do it, because you are no longer welcome in mine. But Mom? No. My voice was firmer than it had been in decades. For 30 years, I waited for you to respect me, to value me, to treat me like what I am, the woman who sacrificed to give you everything you have. But I'm not waiting anymore. I took out my house keys and showed them to him. The copy you had? I changed the locks a week ago. You can no longer just walk in whenever you please to go through my things or pressure me into signing papers. Arthur looked devastated, but I no longer felt the compulsive need to comfort him when he suffered the consequences of his own actions. If, one day, you decide you want a real relationship with me, one where you respect me as a person and not as an ATM, you can call me. But until then, I don't want to see you again. I turned to Edward, who was standing by the entrance as if hoping for a miracle. And you, I said, have exactly 24 hours to get all your things out of my house. After that, I'm changing the locks again, and anything you leave behind is going straight to the trash. Eleanor, you can't just kick me out. I'm your husband. No, you're not. You're a bigamist, which means we were never legally married. The license we signed 30 years ago is worthless because you were already married to Patricia. Edward tried to come closer, but I stepped back. Besides, I'm not kicking you out. I'm freeing you so you can go live with your real wife, the one you've been cheating on me with for years. I hailed a cab, and for the entire ride home, I felt as if I were seeing the city for the first time. The buildings looked more colorful, the traffic didn't bother me, even the air seemed clearer. It was as if I'd been seeing everything through a gray filter for decades, and someone had finally removed it. When I arrived at my brownstone in the South End, I stood outside for a few minutes, admiring the lemon green facade I had painted 5 years ago, a color Edward had always criticized for being too flashy. Now I realized I loved that color because it was cheerful, vibrant, and completely different from the gray, subdued personality I had adopted to please people who would never be satisfied. I opened the door and entered my house, but this time it wasn't like returning to a prison. It was like entering a sanctuary that was finally, completely mine. I walked through the living room, looking at the empty spaces where the furniture Edward had taken was. Instead of feeling sad, I felt liberated. Every empty space was an opportunity to fill it with things I truly loved, not with what he considered appropriate or in good taste. I went to the kitchen and made myself a cup of chamomile tea, using the blue porcelain teapot my mother had given me, which I had kept on the highest shelf for years because Edward said it was too fragile for daily use. How foolish. Life is too short to save beautiful things for special occasions that never come. I sat on my patio, under the dogwood tree I had planted when Arthur was a boy, breathing in the warm afternoon air and feeling every muscle in my body relax for the first time in years. There was no one waiting for me to serve dinner, no one criticizing the temperature of the food, no one asking what I had done with my day as if I needed to account for every minute of my existence. I took out my phone and called Clara, my niece in California. When she answered, her cheerful voice filled me with a warmth I had forgotten existed. Aunt Eleanor. How are you? How did the hearing go? We won, sweetheart. We won everything. I told her the whole story, from the financial revelations to the discovery of Edward's bigamy. Clara laughed, shouted in outrage, and celebrated every small victory as if it were her own. Auntie, I am so proud of you. I always knew you were the smartest woman in the family, but this is beyond anything I could have imagined. You know the strangest part, Clara? I don't feel vengeful or bitter. I feel at peace. Like I finally found my way back to being the person I was before I started living to please others. So what are you going to do now? For the first time in decades, I didn't have an immediate answer. Not because I was confused, but because I had so many options it was hard to choose. I could travel, study something new, take up old hobbies, do volunteer work, or simply rest and enjoy the quiet. I don't know yet, I replied, but for the first time in my life, that uncertainty excites me instead of scaring me. That night, I slept better than I had in years. My bed felt bigger, more comfortable, more my own. There was no snoring to wake me, no need to get up for a glass of water or to find medicine, no pretending to be asleep to avoid uncomfortable conversations about money or responsibilities. It was just me, in my house, in my bed, sleeping the deep sleep of someone who had finally gotten her life back. I woke the next day with a feeling I hadn't experienced in decades, anticipation for what the day might bring. Not nervous anticipation, but genuine excitement for the possibilities that lay ahead. For the first time in 30 years, my time was completely my own. 3 weeks after the hearing, just as I was getting used to the delightful routine of doing whatever I wanted whenever I wanted, I received a call I knew would come sooner or later. It was Samuel, my 14-year-old grandson, his voice cracking as if he'd been crying. Grandma, please, I need to talk to you. Can I come over? Samuel had always been different from the rest of the family. Where Arthur saw numbers and opportunities, Samuel saw people and feelings. Where Jessica saw appearances and status, Samuel saw authenticity and truth. He had inherited my sensitivity, not his parents' materialism. Of course, sweetheart. Come whenever you like. An hour later, Samuel was sitting in my kitchen, drinking hot chocolate and eating the oatmeal cookies I always used to make for him. His eyes were red, and his hands trembled slightly as he held the mug. Grandma, no one at home will explain what really happened. Dad says you went crazy, Mom says you betrayed them, and Edward doesn't live with us anymore. I don't understand anything. I told him the whole story, from the beginning, without omitting details but using words he could understand. I explained how I had worked my whole life to give them the best, how I had secretly saved money to protect myself, how I discovered they wanted to have me declared incompetent to steal my property. Samuel listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding and wiping away stray tears. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time, digesting it all. So, my parents really wanted to put you in a home and take your money? Yes, sweetheart. But it's not your fault, or Sophia's. You're children, you had no way of knowing what the adults were planning. But I did know something, he said, his voice low. I heard Mom on the phone with someone, saying that when we got your house we could sell it and buy a bigger one. And Dad always got mad when we talked about visiting you, said you were a burden. It hurt to hear that from my grandson, but it also confirmed I had made the right choice. And what do you think about all this, Samuel? I think my parents are idiots, he said with the brutal honesty only a teenager can have. You're the kindest, most hardworking person I know. You were always there for us, and they repaid you by trying to rob you. My eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of gratitude. At least one of my grandchildren had inherited decent values. Grandma, can I still come visit you? Even if my parents don't want me to. Of course, sweetheart. You and Sophia will always be welcome in this house. You are not to blame for your parents' mistakes. 2 days later, Arthur showed up at my door unannounced, looking grim and carrying the same air of superiority he'd adopted since marrying Jessica. But I was no longer the woman who was intimidated by his authoritative gestures. Mom, we need to talk. This has gotten out of hand. There's nothing to talk about, Arthur. Everything was said in court. Samuel came to see you on Tuesday. Jessica is furious. You can't be filling his head with strange ideas. Strange ideas like the truth? Like explaining why his step-grandfather doesn't live here anymore? Like telling him his parents tried to rob me? Arthur paced my living room like a caged lion, touching the new furniture I'd bought to replace what Edward had taken. It was simpler but more comfortable, chosen by me for me, not to impress visitors who never came. You're being overly dramatic, Mom. We just wanted to help you. Maybe we went about it the wrong way, but our intentions were good. Good intentions? Arthur, you recorded me talking to myself to present it as evidence of dementia. You went through my bank accounts without permission. You planned to sell my house and put me in a home. Which part of that sounds like good intentions to you? This all could have been avoided if you had just told us from the beginning how much money you really had. I stopped and looked him straight in the eye. Arthur, listen to yourself. You are saying that the love and respect you owe me as a mother and a grandmother depended on how much money I had in the bank. Doesn't that sound sick to you? It's not that. It is exactly that. When you thought I was poor, I was a burden to be cleared out of the way. Now that you know I have money, suddenly you want to talk and fix things. Don't you see how vile that is? Arthur sank into the new armchair, a light blue model I'd chosen because it reminded me of a clear sky. He looked tired, defeated, but still not fully aware of the magnitude of what he had done. Mom, we're family. Families make mistakes, but they forgive each other and move on. Families also respect, care for, and protect each other. You did the exact opposite. Just then, Jessica walked in as if she still had the right to. She was wearing an expensive dress I recognized immediately. It was from a boutique in Back Bay where the prices were equivalent to my monthly salary when I worked at the hospital. Eleanor, that's enough of this tantrum. We need to resolve this like civilized adults. A tantrum? Is that what you call defending myself when you tried to steal my life's work? Nobody wanted to steal anything. We just wanted to make sure you were well cared for in your final years. My final years, Jessica, will be exactly as I decide they will be. Without interference from people who confuse love with greed. Jessica sat next to Arthur, and for the first time, I realized what a perfect match they were. Not because they complemented each other, but because they both had the same ability to justify the unjustifiable and play the victim when faced with the consequences of their own actions. Look, Eleanor, Jessica said, using that condescending tone she reserved for winning an argument, we understand you're upset. But you have to think about Samuel and Sophia. They need stability, and all this family fighting is affecting them. It's affecting them? Samuel came here crying because no one would explain why his family was falling apart. Sophia called me yesterday asking if it was true that I hated them. Do you know who's filling their heads with lies? You are. Children need to understand that adult decisions are sometimes complicated. No, Jessica. Children need to understand that their parents made serious mistakes and that there are consequences for those mistakes. They need to learn that in life, you can't hurt people and then expect everything to go back to normal. Arthur intervened. Mom, what do you want us to do? Spend the rest of our lives apologizing? I don't want you to do anything, Arthur. I don't want anything from you anymore. That's the difference between us, you always want something from me. I no longer expect anything from you. But then, how are we going to solve this? I got up from the armchair and walked to the window overlooking the patio, where the dogwood tree was blooming again. The white blossoms covered the ground like a carpet of renewed hope. There's nothing to solve, because there is no problem. The problem was when I lived believing you loved me when, in reality, you only needed me. Now that I know the truth, I can make decisions based on reality, not on illusions. And what are those decisions? I turned to them, feeling a deep calm I hadn't experienced in decades. You can go on with your lives exactly as you lived them before, but without me. You will not inherit my money, you will not live in my house, and you will not make decisions about my future. Mom, for all practical purposes, I am no longer your mother. I am the woman who raised you, who worked to give you opportunities, who sacrificed so you could have what I never did. But a mother-son relationship is built on mutual love and respect. When that disappears, all that's left is biology, and biology is not enough. Jessica stood up abruptly. You're being completely irrational. Are you going to destroy your own family over pride? I'm not destroying anything, Jessica. You already destroyed this family when you decided my money was more important than my well-being. I'm just acknowledging the reality of the situation. Arthur made one last attempt. Mom, think about it. Without us, you'll be completely alone. I smiled, and it was the first genuine smile I had felt in his presence in years. Arthur, I was alone for 30 years while living with you. The difference is that now, I'm alone by choice, not by abandonment. I walked them to the door, and when they left, I locked it and put the security chain on. Not out of fear, but as a symbolic ritual. I was definitively closing the most painful chapter of my life. That night, I sat on my patio under the stars, sipping a glass of red wine I had bought simply because I liked the name, Rebirth. The wine tasted of freedom, of my own choices, of a future that finally belonged entirely to me. For the first time in decades, I wasn't afraid of being alone. I was afraid I had waited so long to discover how beautiful chosen solitude could be. 6 months after that night with the glass of wine under the stars, my life had changed in ways I never imagined possible. I woke up that October morning not because an alarm clock forced me to, but because my body had found its own natural rhythm. It was 7 o'clock, and for the first time in decades, I got up without feeling the weight of pending obligations on my shoulders. I made coffee in the mocha pot I had bought the week before. It was a small but significant luxury, freshly ground beans from a local Boston roaster, aromatic and strong, a world away from the instant coffee I used to buy when I had to stretch every dollar to cover the family's expenses. As the coffee brewed, I looked out my kitchen window at the patio I had completely transformed. Where before there was only the dogwood tree and a few neglected plants, I now had a small garden bursting with flowers I had planted myself, red geraniums, white daisies, and purple clematis that climbed a wooden trellis I'd had built by a neighborhood carpenter. The gardener I hired, Mr. Felipe, a man my age who had lost his wife the year before, came twice a week not just to tend the plants, but to talk. We had become friends, sharing stories about our complicated pasts and our present full of possibilities. I took my coffee and sat on the new deck I had built using part of my secret funds. It was a small space but perfectly designed for one person, a comfortable chair with blue cushions, a small wrought iron table, and a white umbrella that shielded me from the morning sun. There, on my deck, I had breakfast every morning while reading the newspaper and planning my day. Not because I had unavoidable obligations, but because I had rediscovered the pleasure of having my own projects, activities that excited me, plans that made me look forward to the next day. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, I attended a watercolor class at a community art center near the Arnold Arboretum. I had never had time for frivolous activities like art, but now I discovered I had a natural talent for capturing the light and colors of the flowers in my garden. My instructor, a retired artist in his 60s named Rodrigo, told me my paintings had an emotional honesty that only comes with life experience. On Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, I volunteered at a shelter for women escaping domestic violence in Roxbury. There, I helped other women fill out legal forms, accompanied them to doctor's appointments, and mostly, offered them what they needed most, someone to listen without judgment who understood how difficult it is to leave toxic relationships. One of those women, Guadalupe, 52, had told me something that stuck with me. Eleanor, you give us hope because you show us it's never too late to take back our lives. If you could do it at 72, so can we. Saturdays were dedicated entirely to myself. Sometimes I went to the movies to see films I had always wanted to see but that Edward considered too intellectual or boring. Other times I visited museums, walked through Beacon Hill, or simply stayed home reading novels in my garden. Sundays, I had developed a new tradition, cooking something special just for me. Not the quick, cheap meals I prepared when I had to feed a family, but elaborate dishes that required time and care. Beef bourguignon from scratch, slow-roasted cochinita pibil marinated for hours, a perfect apple pie with a handmade crust. I cooked as if it were a celebration, because every Sunday was a celebration of my freedom. Samuel came to visit every other week, usually on Saturday afternoons. We had developed a whole new relationship, based on mutual respect and honest communication. He told me about his problems at school, his dreams of studying medicine, his worries about the tense atmosphere at home since his parents found out I wasn't leaving them an inheritance. "Grandma," he told me last week as we ate the homemade lasagna I'd made especially for him, "my parents are always fighting about money now. Mom wants Dad to get a better paying job, and he says everything would be easier if you weren't so resentful. And what do you think? I think they made some ugly mistakes with you, and now they have to learn to live with the consequences. It makes me sad that our family is broken, but I understand why you made those decisions." Samuel's maturity at 14 impressed me and filled me with pride. It was evidence that something good had come from all my sacrifices, even if not in the way I had expected. Sophia, my 11-year-old granddaughter, also came occasionally, though less frequently because Jessica had convinced her I was very angry with the family. Little by little, with patience and a lot of love, I was helping her understand that my anger wasn't with her, but with the choices the adults had made. One afternoon in November, as I was painting the clematis on my deck, I received an unexpected call. It was Clara, my niece from California, but this time she wasn't just calling to chat. "Aunt Eleanor, I have some important news. Do you remember telling me you put me down as the beneficiary on your will and bank accounts?" "Yes, sweetheart. Why?" "Well, I've been thinking a lot about it, and I want to propose something different. What if, instead of leaving everything to me, we start a foundation?" The idea intrigued me immediately. Clara explained that she had been researching nonprofits that help older women who are victims of family abuse and financial exploitation. We could create the Eleanor Reed Foundation, dedicated to providing legal aid and temporary financial support to women in situations similar to the one you lived through. Your money would still be helping people, but people who truly need it. The proposal moved me so much that my eyes filled with tears. It was the perfect way to give my money purpose and my suffering meaning. My painful experiences could become hope for other women. "I love the idea, Clara. But I want you to know that a portion will still be for you, because you're the only family who has ever shown me selfless love." That same afternoon, I began working on the legal aspects of the foundation with the same lawyer who had helped me during the hearing. Mr. Aguilar was enthusiastic about the project and helped me structure an organization that could operate effectively for many years to come. A month later, as I was finishing a painting of my garden illuminated by the afternoon sun, I received a text message from an unknown number. It was from Arthur. "Mom, I know you don't want to talk to me, but I need you to know that Jessica and I are getting a divorce. The kids will be living with me. If you can ever forgive me, I'd like you to be a part of their lives again. I love you, and I know I ruined everything." I read the message 3 times before deciding how to respond. I didn't feel satisfaction or pain, just a kind of quiet sadness for all the lost time. I replied, "Arthur, you will always be my son, and Samuel and Sophia will always be my grandchildren. But relationships are built on actions, not words. If you truly want to earn back my trust, you will have to show me with your deeds that you have changed. In the meantime, my grandchildren are always welcome here." I added nothing more. It was enough for now. That evening, as I watered the plants in my garden under the soft glow of the solar lanterns I had installed, I realized something surprising. For the first time in decades, I felt no resentment toward anyone. Not toward Arthur, not toward Jessica, not toward Edward. I had achieved something I thought was impossible: to forgive without forgetting, to release without reconciling, to love without allowing abuse. My life had taken on a completely new rhythm. I no longer lived according to the needs and expectations of others, but followed my own desires and values. It was as if I had been living in a dark room for 30 years and someone had finally opened the curtains to let in the light. That night, sitting on my deck with a cup of chamomile tea and watching the stars that shone over my small personal paradise, I smiled with a deep peace I had never known. I was 73 years old, and for the first time in my life, I was completely free. My rebirth had been painful, but it was worth every tear, every confrontation, every moment of solitude. Because in the end, I had discovered something priceless: that it is never too late to be reborn as the person you were always meant to be. 2 years after that morning in the courthouse that changed my life forever, I wake up every day with a smile that comes from the depths of my soul. Today is my 75th birthday, and for the first time in decades, it's a day I look forward to with genuine joy instead of the melancholic resignation that used to accompany the passage of time. I get up early, not out of obligation but because my body has learned to anticipate the simple pleasures each dawn brings. I prepare my coffee in the mocha pot, now as familiar as an old friend, and step out onto my deck to greet the flowers that have grown lush under my care. The clematis has completely covered the wooden trellis, creating a natural purple roof that filters the morning light like a living stained glass window. The doorbell rings at 9 o'clock sharp. It's Samuel, now 17, tall and slim like his paternal grandfather but with my dark eyes and the same determination that helped me survive so many years of silent abuse. He's carrying a cardboard box and a smile so big it reminds me of the little boy who used to run around the same yard chasing butterflies. Happy birthday, Grandma. I have surprises for you. Samuel is no longer the confused teenager who cried in my kitchen trying to understand why his family had fallen apart. He is a self-assured young man who has learned to distinguish between real love and emotional manipulation, between genuine family loyalty and toxic codependency. Surprises, plural? You just wait, he says, his eyes sparkling with mischief. He opens the box and takes out the first gift, a photo album he created himself, documenting the last 2 years of my new life. Pictures of my garden in different seasons, of my watercolor paintings hanging on the walls of my house, of us sharing Sunday meals, of me receiving an award from the women's shelter where I volunteer. I wanted you to see your transformation from the outside, he explains as we flip through the pages together. Sometimes we don't realize how much we've changed until we see visual evidence. He's right. The woman in these photographs looks radiant, confident, completely different from the stooped, faded woman who appeared in family photos from previous years. This woman smiles with her eyes, not just her mouth. This woman takes up space without apologizing. This woman looks happy. And what's the second surprise? Samuel smiles mysteriously and pulls out his phone. Speakerphone call for Grandma Eleanor, he announces ceremoniously. The voice that comes through the phone makes me jump. Aunt Eleanor. Happy birthday. It's Clara, calling from California, but she's not alone. I hear a chorus of familiar voices, cousins who live in other cities, nephews I had lost touch with, friends from my youth whom Samuel had tracked down through social media with the determination of a private investigator. Samuel coordinated all of us to call you at the same time, Clara explains. He wanted you to know how many people truly love you, not for your money but for who you are as a person. I spend the next hour talking with each of them, reminiscing about old times, receiving invitations to visit, and listening as each one tells me how proud they are of how I handled my family situation. It's as if I have reclaimed not only my money and my dignity but also an entire network of genuine affection I had forgotten existed. When the group call ends, Samuel hugs me. I wanted you to remember that even though you lost a toxic family, you still have a real one that loves you. At 11, Sophia arrives, now 14 and surprisingly similar to how I was at her age, wavy brown hair, a round face, curious eyes that watch everything with attention. She has been living with Samuel and Arthur since the divorce, and she has slowly come to understand the complexity of what happened 2 years ago. Grandma, I made this for you in my art class, she says shyly, handing me a small canvas where she has painted our dogwood tree in bloom. It's not technically perfect, but it's filled with love and the same artistic sensibility she inherited from me. It's beautiful, sweetheart. I'm going to hang it right here on the deck so I can see it every day. Sophia blushes with pleasure. Do you really like it? Mom says I don't have a talent for art, that I should focus on math like Dad. Your mother is wrong, just as she was wrong about many other things. You have a special gift, and I will help you develop it if you want. We spend the afternoon painting together on my deck, she working on a new picture and me teaching her color mixing techniques I've learned in my classes. It's a moment of perfect connection, without the tensions and manipulations that characterized our past family interactions. As evening falls, after the grandchildren have left with promises to return next weekend, I sit alone in my garden to reflect on these 2 years of freedom. The Eleanor Reed Foundation has already helped 43 women escape situations of family abuse and financial exploitation. Clara manages it from California with the efficiency of someone who deeply understands the mission, and I participate in the major decisions from here. Every story of a woman who achieves independence reminds me why all the pain I lived through was worth it. Rose, 68, who managed to divorce a husband who had controlled her financially for 40 years. Maria, 55, who was able to open her own bakery after her sons tried to have her declared incompetent to steal her late husband's inheritance. Carmen, 70, who found the strength to report her family for neglect. They all send me letters or videos telling me how their lives have changed, how they've regained their dignity, how they've learned it's never too late to stand up for themselves. Each testimony validates my decision to turn my pain into purpose. I've heard little from Arthur in these 2 years. Samuel tells me he moved to a more modest apartment, that he has learned to cook and clean for himself, that he is trying to rebuild his relationship with his children based on respect and honest communication instead of authority and control. Apparently, losing access to my money forced him to grow as a father in ways he never had to before. 6 months ago, he sent me a handwritten letter in which he apologized without excuses or justifications. He didn't ask for immediate reconciliation or access to an inheritance. He just acknowledged the harm he had caused me and expressed his willingness to work to earn back my trust, if I were ever willing to give him the chance. I kept the letter, but I haven't replied. I'm not ready yet, and maybe I never will be completely. But for the first time since the trial, I don't feel resentment toward him. Only a quiet sadness for all the time we lost and a cautious hope that perhaps people can change when they face the real consequences of their actions. I've heard nothing directly from Edward, but Samuel told me the bigamy investigation resulted in a hefty fine and the obligation to legally divorce one of his 2 wives. He chose to stay with Patricia, his first wife, in Nashua. Sometimes I wonder if she knows the whole truth about his 30 years of deceit, or if he just constructed a new version of the story where he is the victim of circumstances beyond his control. But it doesn't really matter to me anymore. Edward belongs to a chapter of my life that I have closed for good, like a book you read once and then donate because you no longer need it on your personal library shelf. As the sun sets behind the Boston skyline, painting the sky orange and pink like one of my watercolors, I think of the question I'm often asked by the women I help at the shelter: how do you know when it's time to fight for your dignity? The answer is always the same: when you realize that losing the battle is less painful than continuing to live without self-respect. When you understand that being alone is better than being with people who see you as a resource instead of a human being. When you discover that the fear of solitude is less terrible than the certainty of invisibility. My story didn't end with a perfect family reconciliation like in the movies. It ended with something much more valuable: the recovery of my own voice, the rebuilding of my self-esteem, and the transformation of my wounds into wisdom that can help other women. At 75, I am more myself than I have ever been. I have plans, projects, new friendships, activities that excite me. I have a house that is truly my home, decorated to my taste, filled with things that bring me joy. I have money that I spend on what I want, without asking anyone's permission or justifying every purchase. But above all, I have peace. A deep peace that comes from knowing that I no longer betray my own values to please people who will never be satisfied. A peace that is born from having chosen my own happiness over the comfort of others. Have you ever experienced something similar, or do you know someone who has? Tell me about your experience in the comments. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel so this message can reach someone who needs to hear it. Because we never know who needs to be reminded that they deserve respect, dignity, and true love, no matter how old they are.